of history of electric. If you haven't chosen the best successful career, you may very well be.
It's a pleasure and an honour to welcome you here today, and it's a very special occasion for ElectricalAid, but it's made more special by your presence, and we thank you for coming. Corporate responsibility is one of the new buzzwords, but many companies, including ESB, have been aware of their social responsibilities for a long time. Since ElectricalAid was set up, it's distributed over £17 million, and this aid has gone to institutions in Ireland and overseas. It's made a big difference to the beneficiaries, but I think it's also made a big difference to ESB. It's made us more socially committed, more socially aware. And I'd like here today to acknowledge three groups of people. That small group who established ElectricalAid, congratulations. The people who are running it today, congratulations. And to all the staff and pensioners, retired staff who've contributed to make it the success that it is today, I'd like to thank and acknowledge all of you. I'd now like to ask the President to address the group.
Gwini cwr yn geidal sias ys mi'n lam leis gael y gwael fa sagt gwyl me begon yn dernach fe mi hias lach gorman ag yn cwmotas nawsiwnt de trafadorta so cwysyn mwyl begon yn ar ymach dy byw Chairman, I must first of all say that I'm delighted to be here today. I apologise for my late arrival, but I've been down at the 81st Ploughing Championship in Wexford. And a wonderful occasion, great example of the Irish community not being defeated by climate or the weather. And also of proper forward planning and prescience in which, for example, the people arrived suitably garbed in waterproofs and Wellingtons and others. I'm also very pleased to be here, and I hope to have an opportunity before I go to have it there in the background, the wonderful works of Sean Keating and his brilliant work on a very crucial stage in the history of the ESB, Arna Crusha and Paula Foucault. These paintings are an incredibly important part of the history of Irish art and also of the ESB. They're also a very important part in relation to, I think, the intellectual history of Ireland. And it's one of the good pieces of news that we have curators of the quality of Dr. Emer O'Connor to, in fact, not only advise you on this, but also her advice to the Crawford Gallery for the Keating paintings is marvellous. So it's a very pleasant occasion. I was delighted to accept the invitation. It is true that I started my own career in the ESB, and I worked I am a grade 8 retired. That is, I have the most extraordinary memories of that period. Wonderful period. And there's one point I would say that I might slightly differ with you, Chairman, and it is about the sense of social responsibility in the ESB. I never worked, I would later work in many different settings, but the strength of solidarity among the ESB at that time, in 1960, I was 19 years old, and on to the time I left to eventually go to England and then go to university, was extraordinary. My memory of it is very, very clear. Long after I left, and I had only been there just over 2 years, ESB workers would go to each. There was a very strong social dimension to the union of which I was a member, the ESBOA, which was my first union, and they would, when accidents or anything happened, families were looked after. And years afterwards, people would ring me and tell me that a particular worker had died, and I would attend the funerals. And I was in a position to know so many of them very personally, because my function was I was in wages section. part of my thing was to visit the bank at the corner, the Mounston Leinster as it was at the time. Sorry to say that, but and collect and prepare all of these wages in little brown packets, which I then proceeded to go around with. It was around not long after the introduction of PAYE, so when people who had worked overtime were shocked, I gave them advice on filling in their tax forms in Cullinans afterwards. And I want to get my own back on something now. I found that the visiting auditor, Kevin Heffernan of football fame, was regarded with great apprehension on his visits to our offices in Newtown Smith. But the ESB was it was coming to the time of the end of rural electrification. And we were coming to the end of the switch-on hoolies, which consisted of a cloth over a light bulb which was whisked away as light was brought into the darkness by the local parish priest in County Mayo. But I have the warmest of memories of the ESB and its staff. And lest as chairman, I must tell you now, James O'Toole wrote a great play, and the title of it was produced in the Abbey, and it was called The Board, because ambitious middle rank and some senior ranking bureaucrats would occasionally preface everything they had to say by saying the board. We all knew and it wasn't the Holy Spirit exactly. But now, turning to what I'm here for. Yes, I started my own career in the ESB many years ago, and it is indeed the 25th anniversary of the Social Justice and Development Fund. And I was very happy to have an opportunity to looking at the different projects which begin with the Ethiopian famine. My wife's sister Margaret Coyne, went to Ethiopia during that famine, and she was the longest serving Irish person in Ethiopia for a very long time, having only retired from Ethiopia 2 years ago. She established, originally responding to the famine, and then establishing an eye clinic, and later an HIV clinic, and so on. But I think that the work that was carried out, yes, it might have begun as a humanitarian response, but then it moves, as I could see very clearly, into very positive involvement in development through a whole series of agencies and NGOs that are really respected all over the world. I think that what is very important as well is to acknowledge the vision, indeed, as you say, of the staff and pensioners through ElectricAid, in addition to significant financial contributions. What's even more important is what it makes possible by way of an informed discourse among workers on the issues of justice and equality. The importance beyond just a quick response of responding to distress, but also recognizing that the contribution to long-term benefits and to lasting economic and social progress is even more important. The devastating famine in Ethiopia, the social injustices in Latin America, it's quite shocking to think that a million Ethiopians died during the drought in 1984 alone. And no doubt that at time, I recall, I was in my early 20s, the social consciousness of the country was affected, but the ESB staff responded in a very tangible and meaningful way. Well, I met it, I said I'm coming from the ploughing championship, where people have use science and technology to improve what happens in agriculture. And in some of my informal discussions before I left with some of the people who are involved in farming, I discussed the present position in relation to food with them. For example, the response that is there to the great drought in places in the central, across the United States, its effect on wheat prices, which in turn, in a practical sense for Irish farmers, affects the cost of their inputs. But far more importantly, we're saying to them, we respond now, as I'm saying it, to the famine in Ethiopia. But there are others who have a different response, and 61% of wheat futures are owned by speculative funds at the present time, compared to 12% in the 1990s. And this is truly shocking, So what is a shift in consciousness for one group of people, for another group of people becomes a good hit for investment. And I think this is a serious issue. I remember this period of the 1980s very, very clearly. In 1992, I was honoured by receiving an award, the Sean McBride Humanitarian Award. And I wrote at the time to look at bodies. When I was receiving this award in Helsinki, I wrote that to look at bodies abandoned on a rubbish tip, to write details of torture, to risk a gaze at such wounds of humanity is to choose to be changed forever. That dilemma, put simply, is that once one knows, we can from that moment live only in the bad fate of guilty silence or act. And what is extraordinary is that these workers and pensioners are able to act, and not just a way of actually financially being assistance, but of actually being able to try to understand why it is what is happening. What I have just described, for example, one ethical response is to be deeply moved with it in hearing about famines. Another is to remain silent in relation to the structures that seek to take advantage of that. Because one of the disadvantages of that sort of speculation in wheat futures is that in the last 2 years, the cost of food in Africa has risen by 37%, and many of the NGOs and others would be able to tell you that. So in a way, what you have to try and do in ethics is to try and be consistent in a moral sense of realizing that if you feel a response, delivering through is important. So I think at this particularly challenging economic time, it's very important that I say as well that what I saw with the Electric Aid, it serves, the projects serve as a reminder of so much good that can be achieved through collaboration and teamwork, and that relatively modest and practically focused assistance projects can transform the everyday lives of people of all generations and introduce permanent changes in their living environment. For example, the stove that can be made from mud that I saw, there is so much advantage reducing, needing less energy, making a contribution that is very important in an environmental sense. And one is always important as well. I couldn't but think, for example, of the gender consequences of all of this, because it is female children who are sent to gather fuel or to gather charcoal, often at great risk, even from the refugee camps in southern Sudan. And equally, I think as well that unfortunately, although we have made great gains in relation to participation in education, they're often reversed by the HIV, the consequences of HIV orphans who are looked after by, again, it is the female children who are kept at home. It is a steady commitment, I think, as well. What is very important is that the principles of social justice, they require time and money, but they require even more understanding and critical thinking. And they stand behind the projects that have been assisted that I'm glad to acknowledge. And to be able then, the humanitarian side, to be able to respond promptly and efficiently to crisis situations. What I saw, for example, in response to the tsunami, again, it's important that we acknowledge good news where it occurs. On the international independent evaluations of the aid that went after the tsunami, the Irish aid comes out very much on top. It was regarded as well delivered. It was regarded as very, very little fat in it, and it was wonderful to see that, because all countries who attached themselves to the consequences of the tsunami, the same could not be said for them. I think that the openness of attitude in responding to requests for help and assistance, and the willingness to make a real and positive impact, has meant that in Ireland we have, in fact, it is part of the retention of our best reputation. I think as well, in relation to some of the projects you have assisted, it is one of the great tragedies. My friend Professor Gerard Quinn tells me that if you were to ask who are in fact the most neglected in relation to the receiving countries, it is probably those who are suffering from disability. And while we may have made some gains at home through legislation on disability, and the United Nations Convention has been established now with a very strong contribution from Professor Gerard Quinn, whom I was very proud to say was a former student of my own in the old days. But I think in relation to so many of the countries, when I look at the map of Africa, it is in fact those who are suffering from disability who are the most vulnerable in one country after another. So all of your work has helped education at both primary and vocational level. It's helping sustainable agriculture and food security and health care and HIV/AIDS care, microfinance and micro-enterprise, and on gender, and as I've mentioned, disability and human rights. I can say from my own experience on the ground in developing countries that these kind of interventions are enormously valuable. Might I say as well that I think as Ireland holds the presidency of the European Union in the 1st of January, and I know that there will be meetings. I'm going to Latin America this week, and there will be meetings, for example, between the European Union and the Latin American countries, but also there will be debates in relation to land and hunger and the related issues. It will be a great opportunity to give a leadership on issues. There are some bad models in economics that are now being discarded, but there are very, very bad models as well in relation to the land issue in Africa and in relation to Latin America that could do well with being discarded. I'm always explicit about this, and I'm referring specifically to the views of Professor Fernando de Soto and others, who suggested that really all you had to do was to just create a whole series of titles which would in turn be the collateral for loans, which would in turn